My guest today is Patti Wood. She's the Executive Director of Grassroots Environmental Education. Patti, welcome to the EMF Remedy Podcast.
I'm delighted to be here.
I would love to talk to you about the Baby Safe Project and a couple of other initiatives that you guys have. But first, I'm wondering if you could tell us about what got you into advocacy in this area.
Well, in this area, this was just one of many things that, I had been working on over my career as an advocate for safer environments especially for our children. But the ubiquitous, nature of this came on very, very quickly, right? I mean, all of a sudden, everybody was exposed, like it or not, with all of these different technologies and all of the different devices that people were purchasing. And it really became very concerning when 5G was rolled out and all of a sudden antennas were being placed in front of people's homes in cities, sometimes within a few feet of kids' bedroom windows. And those, as you know, an antenna is on 24/7. And we are, we're just, it's ubiquitous exposure to this type of radiation that really brought us, into this in a big way.
So let's talk about the Baby Safe Project in particular. I first learned about this several years ago and used to have some of the wonderful pamphlets that you guys provide because there's such a great educational opportunity, I think. And, a lot of people don't think at all about EMF exposure and think about it in particular with regard to exposing their children, both before and after they're born. So could you tell us about the Baby Safe Project?
So sure. So I was at a conference. It was actually a very small conference of people who were particularly interested in fetal exposures. And it was up in Connecticut, in Stonington, Connecticut. And Dr. Hugh Taylor, who's the head of OBGYN and reproductive sciences at Yale Medical School, was presenting. And he was giving an overview of the research that he and his colleagues had been doing, where they were just taking simple cell phone radiation, and they had laboratory animals, mice in this case, where they had two cages. You had your exposed mice and your controlled group, who were not exposed, and the pregnant mice were being exposed just to typical cell phone radiation, where your cell phone is constantly reaching out and saying, "Hello, I'm here," to the nearest antenna, right? So even when you're not using it, it's actively working and producing radiation because it's actually in the, it's not in the receiving of the message, but it's actually when you're actually broadcasting, when you're actually sending that message out. So Hugh was telling us that they originally had designed this study to look for tumor growth in the offspring of the exposed pregnant mice. And they didn't find that. And instead, they found that these mice were, the exposed offspring were just, exhibiting behavior that looked like ADD, ADHD in humans, right? I mean, they were just bouncing off the sides of the cage, not a worry in the world. They were having difficulty finding their food, which is very unusual for rodents. And so they just replicated that study and found the same thing. And so then they looked at the prefrontal cortex of the brains of the exposed mice and found that it was wired differently, that there was some interruption in the normal development of that particular part of the brain. So this was really concerning, right? Because we've got pregnant women putting their phones in their pockets over their developing babies and, holding them against their bodies, even though they're inside their bags that they're carrying. And we thought, how simple is this to avoid these exposures to a developing fetus, especially the brain, to say, don't put your phone in your pocket. And Hugh Taylor he says, it's just such an easy thing to do. Why aren't we doing it? I mean, pregnant women are already, avoiding tobacco, alcohol, toxic chemicals, tuna fish sandwiches because of the mercury, right? And so there are already things that they're doing. They're being careful. And this is just another simple thing to do. And so we thought, you know what, this is really important for this next generation because of the ubiquity of cell phones in our environment, and everyone's using them, to just get this information out through OBGYNs, through midwives and doulas and other organizations that work in the prenatal sector. And so we were able to do that. And then we got a lot of interest from other countries, even France being the first one. Their OBGYN society asked if they could translate it into French. And now we have it in quite a few languages, and there are quite a few on the site. And right now we're translating into a few more languages. But we have it available in English and in Spanish as a hard copy for practitioners here in the.
Such an important thing that you mentioned there, and I think so many people aren't aware of this. And I'll try to remember to put a link to a YouTube video that people can watch where I used a recording type of an RF meter and a phone that was not receiving any text messages. It was not receiving any phone calls. It was not sending any text messages, nothing. And you will see in that recording over and over, as Patti mentioned, and over again, it's almost a continuous modification of the natural electromagnetic environment with a completely synthetic type radio frequency radiation that does not have a counterpart in nature. And then, as you mentioned, there are physiological effects, and at this point, there are many physiological effects. And we've only talked about one, which is on the brain. But so interesting that the behavior in the mice is like ADD and ADHD in humans, because, Patti, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, half my life, I didn't hear about ADD or ADHD. Did you have a similar experience?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are many things that we don't even recognize from our childhood, right? Because, for instance, there was one child with asthma in my elementary school, and everyone knew who this child was. And she was not even in my grade level. And we would say, oh, there's, such and such. She's not allowed to run in gym because she can't breathe. And so, I mean, everybody was just like, protective of this one child with asthma. And now, I mean, just across the world, but especially here in America, you have these inhalers and medications that school nurses have on their shelves so that kids can come down throughout the school day, whether it's gym or just sitting in a classroom. They have to come down to have a puff of their inhaler so that they can breathe. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of things have changed. And of course, we could never have even imagined what's going on with the RFR and wireless radiation technology today when we were kids.
Yeah, and asthma in particular seems to have such a strong correlation with the exposure to synthetic EMF. That's very interesting. And I wonder how the education is going with the physicians. So you're making these pamphlets available. Are you getting a warm reception for pediatricians or OBGYNs that want to have this particular, and it's a small booklet is what it is, in their waiting rooms, for example?
It's a pamphlet. It's and it does go through the science, and it gives you recommendations on how to reduce your exposure if you're pregnant. It's like you say, it's something that people don't even think about. It's invisible, and it's silent, right? You can't see it, you can't hear it. It's one of these things that you just tend to ignore because it's not. There's no evidence that there's any harm being done. So it's a tough one, but we have had good reception from, I hate to say it, but enlightened OBGYNs who are interested in environmental exposures having, some impact on human health. And that is growing, although in medical schools, doctors do not or and are not they don't take courses in environmental medicine. They're not required to. There may be a single course that may be required, a lecture on secondhand smoke, and they can sit in the back of a lecture hall, snoozing away while somebody's talking about cotinine, which is your breakdown product of nicotine. But anyway, they're not able to either recognize or manage environmentally caused symptoms or illnesses. And so, we have enlightened OBGYNs. We have a growing number of holistic OBGYNs. We have a growing number of centers for pregnancy, where there are where some type of a healthcare provider, not necessarily an MD, who is aware of these problems. And it's such a simple fix. I mean, it's just, don't put your phone in your pocket. I mean, it's just something that we want more people to know about. We're basically saving this next generation from having neurological deficits for their whole life. It's crazy.
Yeah, a small modification in behavior, and it doesn't cost anything. And there
Doesn't
is
cost anything.
Yeah, and there is more that you can do, of course. And I talk forever and ever on my podcast about all the different ways you can reduce radiation. But the big thing that everybody in the 21st century needs to know is the further you are from the source of radiation, the better,
Yeah.
In terms of if you're trying to avoid exposure. So simply increasing distance, as you are proposing, is going to make a huge difference. And then beyond that, if people want to get on with the hands-free, or want to go to a wired rather than a wireless solution, et cetera, there's much more that can be done. But how about if we get everybody in the United States and the world, at least as far as, don't put it in your pocket, don't put it on top of where that baby is trying to develop.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, proximity is everything when it comes to this type of radiation exposure. And so, I like to talk about laptops and the unfortunate name that they have given these laptop computers, right? Because you should never use laptops in your lap.
Right.
Soft tissue, reproductive organs are particularly sensitive of RF radiation. And there you are, just placing this radiation emitting device right on top of those organs. You talked about headphones. The proximity to your brain makes these particularly problematic. If you're going to use headsets of any kind, use an air tube headset. An air tube headset works on the same principle as you want to just, there's no wire going into your ear with an air tube headset. You just have this clear tube with sound going into your ear. They work great. And that's maximum protection from radiation if you're going to use a wireless headset. And then, turn off your routers. They don't have to be on while you're sleeping, but they're continuing to emit radiation. So just turn them off at night. And smart TVs and virtual reality and all that stuff, game consoles and headsets, I mean, they can all be hardwired. Everything can be hardwired. We ran a music company. We were delivering music files overseas to Sony. We would just, everything in our office, everything in our studio was hardwired. They would say, wow, that was really fast. It was fast and clean. And, it's the best way to do it. So anyway, it's important to understand that proximity is very, very important.
Yes,
So
I agree.
stay away.
Yep. And we've talked about several physiologic effects that are known. I would add to my high school days, we had one diabetic in my high school. It was a pretty large high school, and it was a real, as different as having, that one asthmatic that you mentioned in yours. And now, of course, diabetes is all, I don't know how common. Every third person, it seems like, has it, and yet there's a clear correlation for people who might be interested. Dr. Magda Havas has some interesting studies on that. So let's talk about the other projects that you have, which are EMF related, that people would be interested in.
Sure. So, we focus with all of our programs on children because kids are uniquely vulnerable. If you see a kid with a wireless device in their hand, they're right there. They're looking at it within just a couple of inches of their face, because that's the way kids do things. They learn about their environment through their senses. They're always touching and smelling and feeling and looking at things at really close proximity. But, we talked about the ubiquitousness of technology, and now our school classrooms, across the United States are just filled with wireless technology. And that's really quite problematic because you have a large number of children in a small space with a pretty powerful router, right? That is going to be, powering, 30 devices or more, or a little less, who knows? But they're all squeezed together. So the child not only has their own laptop in front of them or tablet, but they have their peers, their classmates' tablets and laptops all around them. If you took a meter and measured in the center of a table, a communal table that they often have in classrooms, the radiation levels are absolutely sky high. I mean, just unbelievably off the charts. Okay. And then you have added things in the classroom. You have smart boards, and you've got the teacher with her cell phone. And in the older grades, all the kids have their cell phones in the classroom as well. So you think about just the typical size of a school classroom, and you've got 30 radiation emitting devices, keyboard devices, and then you've got 30 cell phones, and then you've got the router, and that is a real hotspot. We're talking about a real hotspot here. So one of the things that we have done is to develop a program called the Tech Safe School, where we give parents, teachers, administrators, and IT people in those schools things that they can do to reduce the amount of radiation in those classrooms, starting with the router. Now, all routers come from their factory set at the highest, right? And so you can actually turn the power down on those routers by like 90% and still give those kids access to the internet and everything else that they need to do their tech related work. So that's one thing. And then of course there are ways to move the router so that it's not right above the children, right above the teacher, to an area that's in the ceiling that's right above the door. Okay. So because you're not allowed to have chairs and kids and desks and whatever at the door because of fire. So use that, it's a rule that is already existing in every single school across America, and put your router there. Okay. Put your router where you don't have, and here we're talking about proximity again, right? So there are a lot of different things that you can do in a school classroom that are really important. And we have encouraged schools to hardwire. We have worked with probably 24 school districts as well as private schools across the country to help them achieve this transition to a wired environment. And not a single one has actually done it. So we don't have a single school, private or public, in the United States that is not using wireless technology. In Canada, there are a few, but not here.
Let me just, I have to jump in. This is such a national embarrassment.
Yes, it is.
Other nations are not radiating their children.
That's right.
Banks, for example, or large corporations, they don't use wireless because it's less secure. It also
100%.
It is less harmful, of course. It's faster as well to go wired. But even just this one step of reducing, if we can just start there, like don't put your phone next to your baby before or after it's born would be a good thing. And no baby monitors, of course, wireless RF emitting baby monitors. But this first step of in schools, let's at least turn down the radiation and place the router, if you must have a router, in the place that's been then mentioned there next to the door. And what a national embarrassment for the United States that other nations have to lead the way. Sorry, I just and the thing is that these are non-consensual exposures, right? So if one parent
Right.
becomes aware of the harm and they say, I don't want Johnny or little Helen to be exposed to this type of radiation. Are you kidding me? What's the option for opting out, Patti?
Right. Well, there is no option for opting out. So you do have other policies around the world for schools, okay, for the use of this type of technology in schools that have banned it. Like in France, they've banned it in kindergarten. There's no access to it in kindergarten, and then it restricts Wi-Fi in the younger grades. And Cyprus and Israel and Belgium and French Polynesia, these are rather remote places, some of them, but they have decided that children shouldn't be exposed because they are uniquely vulnerable, right? Because their brains are still developing. And so many of the problems associated with this, the physical problems, are neurological. And so there's deeper penetration of RFR in the brain, especially, the younger children. There's shorter distances between, from the skull to the brain center. And they have thinner skulls and higher conductivity of tissues, right, which allow higher intensities of RFR into the eyes and the brain. And you can go on and on and on about why they are uniquely vulnerable. It's just all physiological. They're just not mature yet, right? Their bodies are still developing. Their bones are still getting harder. There's a lot of things happening. But I have to say that the thing that makes people think twice about it is understanding that even the insurance companies that insure, the reinsurance companies that insure these big tech companies, are saying, nope, not going to do it. We've done all the research, we've looked at all the studies, and we're basically saying, this liability risk for us is too great for the insurance companies because they've done their homework. Lloyd's of London says, and I can quote this, that it will not cover claims arising out of or resulting from or contributed to by electromagnetic fields, electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetism, radio waves, or noise. In other words, wireless radiation from wireless antennas, including 5G small antennas, is not covered by their policies.
Yes, and the
What does
wireless
that say?
and the
What does that
wireless
say?
yes, and the wireless companies have to disclose every year that they have these liabilities that are
That's right.
open-ended. And so we've talked about that before. We're getting a lot of noise from your microphone, by the way. Papers and whatnot or something.
Yeah, sorry. Is better?
No. I can hear you fine. Just some rustling and
Oh, okay. Sorry.
proximity of items there.
I was just looking for that one. I was looking for that quote from Lloyd's of London.
Yeah, and if people are listening to me, they already know of the problems, but with this unprecedented replacement of the natural electromagnetic environment with a synthetic version that's never been proven to be without harm. But even if people are not yet there in their awareness, there's this good old principle called the precautionary principle. And that says basically that until or unless something that is suspected that it might be a harm, the only rational thing to do is to avoid exposure until at some point in the future it's proven to be safe. And we're not seeing that
Exactly.
proof of it being safe,
So,
not even close to it. Yeah.
Right. You're right. And another way to talk about the precautionary principle is that if there's an indication of harm, that you should you should limit or reduce those exposures until, even without scientific certainty, because scientific certainty is a really hard thing to get, right? I mean, in the scientific world, people just throw up their hands and say, you're always going to have a study that's going to dispute the study that was just that was done just prior to it. But so if there's an indication of harm, precautionary measures should be taken even without scientific certainty. And for this particular issue, you should absolutely be taking precautionary measures. I wanted to mention one more thing, Keith, and that is that it's hard to get parents, teachers, and administrators interested in this because they are addicted to their phones. They are addicted to wireless technology. And so it's hard for them to admit, to recognize that there's some harm that can come from these exposures and from using this technology when they do it all day long, all night long. I mean, how many times do you see kids get off the bus? Their parents are there waiting for them. The kids get off the bus all ready to tell their parents about, their show and tell, presentation, or, how well they did and, on this test, or, that they had a great violin lesson or whatever it is. And the parents are just stuck on their phones, and they're just walking along with the kids walking behind them, where the parents are on their phones.
It is absolutely tragic. Sometimes I feel like somebody going into the ghettos and trying to help alcoholics. And, I imagine myself coming upon one who's passed out in a gutter and waking him up and telling him, did you know drinking alcohol is not good for you? That's sort of the mental image that I have of trying to get this message out to people who are addicted to their technology. And that addiction is purposeful. There's something called the dopamine-driven response cycle. It's a method of cybernetic conditioning for the human organism. And all social platforms are optimized around that. But I want to go back to, that'll be a bit much for some people to hear about. But, let's go back to the precautionary principle for just a moment. What if schools did as we're saying? And what if mothers did as we're saying? What would it cost them? And what would be the potential downside of taking some precaution?
Well, first of all, it doesn't cost anything to turn down the power or the radiation output of the router. This just doesn't cost a penny. It's a piece of software that your IT person can get into and just turn it down. It's nothing. And it costs nothing. Your IT people are salaried staff, right? It costs nothing to have them move the router above the door as opposed to in the middle of the classroom. So, you can do very, very simple things. You can also not let your children in your classroom, even if they want the kids to sit on the floor and bring their computers or their tablets with them, that they shouldn't actually ever put them on their laps, ever. So they should not do that. They should have story hour without a computer on their lap, or they have a lesson without a computer on their lap. And also about, not being so close to the desk for putting the screen slightly away from the kids as well, because there's this huge number of children now, growing number of kids being diagnosed with myopia or nearsightedness. And that's another big problem, is that, they're spending all their time looking at things that are just a couple of inches away from their face, and they're developing these eye problems. And a lot of kids are wearing glasses now that, we didn't see before. Like, we go back to our childhood again, right? There were a couple of people who wore glasses. Now it's a lot of kids wearing glasses.
Truly.
And so myopia, kind of a developing eye problem for kids who have spent so much of their time on screens. So there's a lot of things that can be done for free. Hardwiring, it's not a big deal, right? I mean, every router has an Ethernet input, right? And so you can actually have these different things that have been that have been created. In fact, we created something called the spider, and I don't have a picture of it, and I don't have it in my hands right now, but it's a fairly heavy weighted thing that looks like a spider or a spaceship. We call it a spider because there are 8 inputs for kids to, to plug in, so that kids can actually get adapters, or the school can buy adapters, which is a relatively cheap thing to do when you think about what schools spend money on. Get adapters for whatever devices they are using or they have given to the children. And those adapters can just be, attached to an Ethernet cable, and into the spider it goes. And those just sit fairly heavy weighted so they don't slip off, the table. And they can just be hardwired just like that. Simple, simple, simple.
All right,
As you
great.
say, safer, more secure, and obviously not emitting radiation.
Right. Okay, so we've talked to 2 initiatives, the Baby Safe Project and the Tech Safe Schools. Was there a third?
Yeah, the third one is Americans for Responsible Technology. And that is actually the umbrella organization for a coalition of organizations around the country that were initially just fighting G. Okay, we created Americans for Responsible Tech because of this proliferation of antennas being erected in people's neighborhoods, and they were putting them on light poles and telephone poles, and it was just an amazing thing. And they're still there. You can't have 5G without 3G or 4G either, because 3G and 4G is talk and text, right? And 5G is for all those other special things that you want. And because of the short length of the waves for G, they need to be in close proximity to the user. And so that is the reason for these close installations to where people are living. And so that was a huge deal. And a lot of people around the country were fighting that. And so, they actually developed not just local organizations, but state organizations to fight it. And where the telecoms were there, and they had, their map of where they're going to put all their antennas, and, people were fighting the locations. And yet the law says you can't fight any of these installations based on health reasons.
Stop right there for a minute. I really
Yeah.
want people to understand this. In my own county, where we have a situation where an individual moved to a very remote area because they required low radiation exposures. We found out also over time that there were a number of other people that had done the same thing that we were unaware of. And then, of course, what happens is there will never be enough cell phone towers anywhere. There's always a desire to put up one more. And so people did what they're meant to do. They assembled together, and they provided their inputs to, in this case, the county commissioners. And we're told exactly what Patty's saying, so I'm just taking this opportunity to reinforce what she's saying, that you can argue anything that you want as long as it has nothing to do with human health. And that's my...
Of course, that's why people are concerned about it and don't want those towers, is because of the health impacts.
Yeah,
but they're not allowed to say that. So they can talk about aesthetics. They can talk about, that we don't like, these, what these towers look like in our community. They can sometimes, beat them by saying that this is a historic district in our community, and they're not allowed to place them in historic districts, but they have very few options. As far as one of the other things is that, and I wanted to just continue on this thing. So you can fight it as far as aesthetics and historic locations. And you can also fight it on the fact that there's no gap in the coverage. That you're putting an antenna in a place where we already have perfectly fine cell service. And so there are a lot of, as far as, going out and, just testing every street, to make sure that there was a good cell phone coverage, and there was, and yet they wanted to put an antenna right in the middle of that area. So some people have won these battles, but it's few and far between. The industry is very, very powerful, and the The FCC, which is supposed to be regulating this industry, is really enabling this industry, not regulating, enabling. The Sabre School for Ethics at Harvard has said that the FCC is the most captured agency in Washington. And for sure, I do agree with that, although we have issues with the FDA and the EPA as well.
Right, that's right.
But the FCC is really a captured agency. So the industry has literally just to lean on these laws that have been passed and say, no, there you go. Can't do anything about it. No options.
All right. So to kind of summarize from my perspective, and I'll give you a chance to correct me if I'm wrong, but if you are or are considering becoming pregnant or know anybody who does, how about avoiding wireless tech to the extent possible, just as you would avoid alcohol or asbestos or lead or any of a number of other environmental toxins, and you already have all the information you need to accomplish that. I'll put a link. I'll try to remember to put a link for an Air headset for those of you who would like to do that. And with regard to tech-safe schools, and this will be news for some people, you don't need Wi-Fi to connect to the internet.
Absolutely not.
And you don't need to have access out in the hallway or, any of but a few different prescribed locations where the children might want to have access to the technology. So there's no logical, no rational reason to have radio frequency radiation in abundance, both from the infrastructure to support the communications as well as the individual devices like cell phones and like tablets and like formerly called laptops, now called notebook computers. All of those produce radiation that you might not be aware of. So we can eliminate all of that by going wired. And then the Safe Technology group, how do people get all of this information? If they're interested or passionate about any one of these particular areas, Patti, where do they go to get either the individual pieces of information we've talked about or just be able to direct their friends for more information?
Okay, so for the Baby Safe Project, it's babysafeproject.org, all spelled out, babysafeproject.org. And on there, you can actually hear, there are 2 videos on there. You can hear Hugh Taylor talking about his research at Yale, which is very compelling. And there are also peer-reviewed academic research, studies on the site as well. There is also a joint statement that OBGYNs and other medical doctors and PhDs, as well as other medical professionals have signed, recognizing the importance of protecting the unborn child from this type of radiation exposure. And you can also get the brochure to download in all languages right off the site. So that's one. The Tech Safe School site is just techsafeschool.org. Actually, it's schools with an S on it, techsafeschools.org. And that has just a wealth of information for the technical people, the IT people in the school. It tells you exactly how to do these things, actually how to turn things down, how to do the measurements of the amount of radiation in the classrooms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It also has resources for parents, and there's a lot of science in there as well, and just specifically about children and their use of technology and the different things that we're seeing. It's from behavior to cancers. And then we have Americans for Responsible Technology. And that's kind of our clearinghouse. We have a lot on that site that's really, really interesting. And you can use that if you go to a meeting with your school board, or you go to a community meeting, a municipal meeting. There's something on that site called the treasure chest. And inside the treasure chest, you have statements by the American Cancer Society, you have statements by the American Academy of Pediatrics, You have all kinds of really important documents in this whole fight against this type of technology and the impact that it's having on humans. And so that's really important. I would just go and print out all of those really important documents and take them with you to a board meeting and say, this is what we're talking about. It's not just me. It's not just me, and I'm trying to protect my own child. This is what is happening. That we have, the National, Cancer Institute saying XYZ, the American Academy of Pediatrics saying that current regulations are not strong enough to protect the unborn child and young children. And it's falling on deaf ears at the FCC. It's falling on deaf ears with the telecoms. They just don't care. They're making so much money that it's just like any other big business that knows that its technology or its products are causing harm, that are just not going to do anything about it as long as there's a money stream and they're making money for their shareholders. That's where we are.
One final question, and then I'll let you add anything before we close. But I often hear people say that this is about money. It's because the wireless industry that's making so much money, or the FCC that's sympathetic to that. And it all has to, and certainly, as there is smoke with fire, there is money to be made. But I think it's something much more. I think it's evil. I think it is for harm. And perhaps I'm alone in that. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Patti, or not, but I'll give you the last word here before we close up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this technology is really destroying families. It's destroying the opportunity for children to grow up with nature and with playing outdoors and having what I would consider a normal childhood. So it really is destroying a way of life that we have been very diligent about providing for our children for decades and decades. We know how important it is, and yet we are just letting it all fall by the wayside so that our kids can have the latest device and the latest video game or whatever it is that they want. It's really quite disturbing to see how children are growing up, and of course these children are going to be adults quite soon and making decisions about everything in our society. So it's a little bit frightening. And evil, I don't know, Keith.
I'm going
to let you keep the.
I'll take that. I don't mind at all.
No, I mean, it is evil if people, they know it. Okay, the telecoms know the damage that they're doing. They understand what's happening. They understand what social media is doing to our kids.
Sure.
Yes, that's evil.
So in the 21st century, when there are so many confusing things going on, I think it's important to separate what is being promoted from what is occurring. So whether people agree that there's evil intent behind these things or not, we know that what the result is seems to be increased suffering in the world and an increased sense of detachment, as you've mentioned. And Patti, you and I are probably have a lot of fond memories of how children used to play in community with one another all the time. And there would be gangs of children happily riding around on their bicycles and playing spontaneously made up games and not having an entire focus like this. So I'll give you the last word and then we'll continue.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. And there are still parents who find that this is really, really important for their children. And they have real limits on their kids' use of technology. But, I think that we are raising a whole generation that really doesn't know what to do when they're outdoors. They're raising a whole generation that doesn't feel like they are part of nature. That is it's very sad.
Patti, Patty, thank you so much for all that you do and in helping people to understand and to raise awareness around the areas that we've talked about today, and then giving people tangible things that they can do right now to reduce their family's personal exposure. So thank you today. Thank you for coming today. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
The EMF Remedy podcast is a project of EMF Remedy LLC. We'd like to be your trusted guide for achieving a better EMF environment in your home. The contents on this podcast are provided for informational purposes only and are not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice. Opinions of guests on this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the EMF Remedy podcast.